The land came before the neighborhood. That was the truth nobody on the board ever bothered to learn. Long before the sidewalks were poured and the lawns were trimmed into matching shapes, the property sat quiet and uneven. Rain moved where gravity told it to go. Water pooled, drifted, and slowly cut paths through the soil. The dam was not a feature outed for looks, it was a response to years of watching how water behaved when nobody controlled it. I built it after the third heavy season in a row when runoff turned the lower end of the land into a shallow lake. It was not large, it was not dramatic, it did not block a river or change a skyline. It was a reinforced earth barrier, set low, shaped to slow water and redirected into a drainage path that led away from where people lived. Engineers would call it simple. Locals would call it common sense. It worked. For years, storms came and went. Water rose behind the dam, spread out, lost its speed, and drained safely away. The soil held. The trees stayed rooted. The lower lots stayed dry. Nobody noticed, which meant it was doing exactly what it was meant to do. Then the neighborhood arrived. Construction crews moved in with bright vests and heavy machines. Streets appeared where dirt paths had been. Houses rose in rows that cared more about symmetry than slope. The dam remained, mostly ignored, sitting just outside the formal boundary of what the developers called the managed area. At first, that distance mattered. Later, it did not. The HOA formed the way they always do, quietly at first. A few meetings, a few volunteers, then rules, then fines, then authority that grew faster than understanding. The board members rotated, but the mindset stayed the same. Uniformity was safety. Control was value. Anything that did not fit the paperwork was a problem waiting to happen. The dam did not fit the paperwork. The first letter came during a dry month. It stated that an unauthorized structure existed near the boundary of HOA-managed land. It cited bylaws that had been written after the neighborhood was built, rules that assumed the land had always been flat and obedient. It demanded proof of approval. I sent documentation, old permits, survey maps, environmental assessments older than the HOA itself. I explained the purpose of the dam in plain language. I included photographs from past floods that showed the difference before and after it was built. Weeks passed, no response. The second letter arrived with a different tone. This one referenced unpaid fees. It claimed I owed money for unauthorized modifications affecting shared drainage. The amount was not large, but the accusation was. It implied neglect, it implied refusal, it implied that I was trying to avoid responsibility. I sent another packet, this time certified, this time with timestamps, receipts, and a timeline that showed the dam existed before the HOA. I explained that the structure protected their properties more than mine. I requested a site visit. Silence answered again. Then the notices began to stack. Late fees, penalties, warnings of enforcement action. Each one referenced the same unpaid balance, a balance that only existed because they refused to acknowledge the records I had already sent. I attended a board meeting. I sat in a folding chair under fluorescent lights while people discussed fence colors and mailbox placement. When my turn came, I laid everything out. I did not argue, I did not raise my voice. I explained the land, the water, the history. They listened with the kind of attention that looks polite but changes nothing. The board chair thanked me and said the matter would be reviewed. It was not. What came instead was a notice of violation with a deadline. Remove the dam or the HOA would take corrective action. The language was sharp now, final, confident in its authority. I requested mediation. I asked for a delay until an independent assessment could be done. I warned them that removing the dam without understanding the drainage would cause harm. I used simple words. I did not threaten. I did not exaggerate. They did not respond. Work crews arrived on a clear morning. Trucks marked with contractor logos I did not recognize parked near the site. Bright tape went up. Machines followed. I stood at the edge of my property and watched soil that had held through years of storms get torn apart in hours. The reinforced core was broken open, the shaped slopes flattened, channels that guided water were erased, dirt was pushed aside like it had never mattered. Nobody asked me anything. By the end of the day, the dam was gone. In its place was an uneven scar of loose earth and exposed ground. The natural basin that once slowed water now had no barrier. The drainage path that led away from homes was partially blocked by debris. The HOA sent a final letter that evening. It stated the violation was corrected. It included an invoice for the work. It declared the matter closed. I stood there as the sun dropped behind the houses and felt something shift. Not anger, not fear, something quieter. The land was exposed now. The water would come the way it always did, only faster. Forecasts had already started to change. The dry weeks were ending. A system was forming offshore, heavy and slow. The kind that brought steady rain, not quick storms. The kind that tested the shape of the ground and the choices made on it. The neighborhood lights came on one by one. Sprinklers clicked on, oblivious to what the sky was preparing. I looked at the bare earth where the dam had been and knew the next chapter was already written by gravity and rain. The first rain arrived without drama. It came as a soft, steady fall that darkened the soil and pulled a clean smell from the ground. From a distance, it looked harmless. Gutters whispered. Leaves trembled. The neighborhood moved through its routines without pause. Cars came and went. Garage doors opened and closed. Children played inside, unaware of how quickly the balance had shifted. I walked the boundary line early that morning. The scar where the dam had been was already changing. Loose earth drank water too fast, then gave it back just as quickly. Small channels formed where the machines had torn through compacted layers that once held firm. The drainage path, now half filled with debris, began to clog. Water slowed where it should have moved, then spilled where it never had before. This was only the beginning. By afternoon, the rain thickened. It stopped being a background sound and became a presence. The soil could not absorb what was coming. Without the dam to spread the load, water gathered speed and direction. It pushed downhill with purpose, finding every low point the planners had ignored when they flattened the land to fit neat property lines. The first signs were subtle. A backyard fence line sagged where water pooled against it. A patch of grass near the storm drain darkened into mud. One of the newer homes at the edge of the development saw water creep up to the patio steps, then retreat, then return again with more force. Still, nobody panicked. The HOA sent an email that evening reminding residents to secure outdoor furniture and report minor drainage issues through the proper channels. It read like every other notice they had ever sent. Calm, controlled, confident that the systems in place were enough. They were not. Overnight, the rain did not stop. It settled in. The kind of weather that does not rush and does not leave. Water filled the shallow basin where the dam once stood, then overflowed immediately because there was nothing to slow it. Instead of spreading wide and shallow, it surged forward in a narrow, forceful stream. By morning, the lower streets glistened under a thin layer of water. Storm drains gurgled, overwhelmed by volume and debris. Leaves, soil, and broken roots washed into them, reducing their capacity even further. The neat slopes around the houses funneled runoff directly toward the same points, concentrating the flow instead of dispersing it. I watched from higher ground as neighbors stepped outside and stared at the water climbing their driveways. Phones came out, pictures were taken, messages were sent. At first, the tone was curious, even amused. A few people joked about free car washes and unexpected ponds. Then a curb disappeared. Water rose past the sidewalk and into the street, erasing the clean lines that defined where one property ended and another began. It seeped under garage doors and soaked storage boxes. Lawns turned into slick sheets of mud that offered no resistance at all. The HOA office lights were on early that day. Emails went unanswered. Calls went to voicemail. The board members who had signed off on the dam removal were now residents themselves, watching the same water climb the same steps. Midday brought heavier rain. The sky pressed low and gray, unbroken. Wind pushed sheets of water sideways, forcing it against walls and windows. The drainage system failed in stages, each collapse feeding the next. What little water had been moving away now had nowhere to go.
At the site of the former dam, erosion accelerated. The loose soil gave way in chunks, widening the breach and sending more debris downstream. What had once been a controlled release became a surge. The ground reshaped itself according to physics, not bylaws. The first house flooded before noon. Water reached the electrical outlets in the garage, then climbed the drywall. Furniture floated, appliances tipped. The smell of wet insulation filled the air. Neighbors rushed to help, wading through knee-deep water that moved faster than it looked. Emergency services arrived and quickly realized the scale of the problem. This was not a single blocked drain or a burst pipe. This was a neighborhood built without respect for the land beneath it, now paying interest all at once. By late afternoon, several streets were impassable. Cars stalled where engines met water. Residents were told to shelter in place or evacuate if they could do so safely. The rain showed no sign of easing. I received a message from the HOA that evening. The tone had changed completely. It asked if I had any insight into the flooding. It mentioned the dam, now referred to as a former structure, and asked if its absence could be contributing. I did not reply. Not out of spite, but because the answer was already written across the neighborhood in brown water and broken fences. Nothing I could say would change what gravity had already decided. As night fell, power flickered. Street lights went dark one by one. Reflections of emergency vehicle lights danced across the water that filled the streets. The soundscape shifted from rain to sirens, from quiet confidence to urgent motion. The basin where the dam once held firm now fed a continuous flow toward the heart of the neighborhood. Every hour without relief compounded the damage. The land, stripped of its restraint, did exactly what it had always been waiting to do. The storm system stalled overhead, trapped by weather patterns far beyond local control. Forecasts now spoke in totals and warnings. More rain was coming, much, much more. I stood at my window, listening to the steady drumming on the roof, and understood that this was no longer about a single decision or a single structure. It was about a chain of choices that had ignored history in favor of authority. Down below, water kept rising. The night held its breath, waiting for the next failure to give way.
Morning did not bring relief. The rain softened for a short while, but the damage had already taken on a life of its own. What people often forget about water is that it remembers momentum. Even when the sky pauses, the ground keeps sending everything downhill. Saturated soil could not hold anything anymore. Every slope became a slide. Every low point became a collection basin. By sunrise, the neighborhood no longer looked planned. The careful symmetry was gone. Streets blended into yards. Yards blended into retention ponds that were never designed to exist. Mailboxes leaned at odd angles. Trash bins floated where they had been left the night before. The HOA office flooded early. Water pushed through the front door and spread across the lobby floor. Filing cabinets soaked from the bottom up. Paperwork that once held so much power curled and bled ink. Computers shut down. The place that had issued so many warnings now stood silent and dark, stripped of its authority by a few inches of water. Board members began to gather outside, standing in clusters, shoes soaked, faces tight. They spoke to each other with urgency now, pointing toward the lower streets, toward the area near my land, toward the gap where the dam had been. The confidence they once carried had been replaced by confusion and a growing sense of panic. Emergency crews returned in force. Sandbags were placed where possible, though it was already too late for many homes. Pumps were brought in, but the volume overwhelmed them. Water removed from one area simply appeared in another, redirected by the altered terrain and clogged drains. The lower section of the neighborhood took the worst of it. Homes closest to the former drainage path filled first. Basements disappeared under murky water that carried soil, oil, and debris. Walls warped, flooring buckled. The smell of damp wood and sewage hung heavy in the air. Residents moved what they could to upper levels, abandoning the rest to the slow, relentless rise. Insurance adjusters began arriving even as the rain continued. They walked carefully, boots sinking into mud, cameras clicking. Their expressions told the story before their reports ever would. This was not a freak event. This was a failure of planning and alteration. By midday, the rain returned in full force. Sheets of water poured down, turning already flooded streets into flowing channels. The gap where the dam had stood widened further. What remained of the earthworks collapsed inward, releasing another surge downstream. Each collapse added speed. Each surge carved deeper paths that would not be easily undone. A temporary command center was set up on higher ground. Officials coordinated evacuations, shelters opened. Residents carried pets, bags, and whatever dry belongings they could manage through water that now reached their waists in some areas. The HOA sent out another message, this time through multiple channels. It urged calm, it promised investigations, it mentioned unexpected conditions and extreme weather. It avoided responsibility with careful wording that no longer fooled anyone. I received a call in the afternoon. A board member left a message asking me to come speak with them. The voice sounded strained, almost pleading. They wanted clarification, they wanted solutions, they wanted help. I stood at the edge of my property and watched water move exactly where the old maps said it would if left unchecked. I had warned them. I had documented everything. I had asked for assessments. They had chosen enforcement over understanding. There was nothing left to clarify. As the day wore on, the scale of loss became impossible to ignore. Dozens of homes were unlivable. Roads were damaged beneath the water, their foundations undermined. Utility lines failed. Power outages spread in uneven patches, adding darkness to an already heavy mood. News crews arrived by late afternoon. Cameras focused on submerged cars and residents wading through floodwater. Microphones captured frustration, disbelief, and anger. The word HOA began to appear in headlines, paired with questions about accountability. The dam became a talking point. Reporters dug into records. Old permits surfaced. Aerial images showed the scar where the structure had been removed and the direct path water now followed into the neighborhood. Experts were interviewed, explaining in calm, measured tones how small changes in drainage could lead to massive consequences. The board members stopped giving statements. By evening, the rain finally began to ease. Not enough to reverse anything, but enough to reveal the full extent of what had happened. Water levels stabilized, then slowly began to recede in some areas, leaving behind thick layers of mud and debris. What remained was devastation. People returned to their homes to assess the damage. Some cried quietly. Others stared in silence. A few shouted, their anger searching for somewhere to land. Conversations shifted from weather to decisions, from rain to responsibility. The gap where the dam had been and now looked like a wound carved deep into the land. It was wider than before, shaped by forces that could not be undone with paperwork or fines. It pointed directly toward the heart of the neighborhood, a clear line of cause and effect. As night fell again, the storm clouds broke apart and stars appeared for the first time in days. The quiet that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy, weighted with loss and realization. The neighborhood had been claimed, not just by nature alone, but by arrogance layered on top of ignorance. And as the water slowly withdrew, it began to expose something even more damaging than soaked walls and ruined floors: the truth. When the water pulled back, it did not leave quietly. It left lines on walls that marked how high it had climbed. It left mud packed into corners that hands could not easily reach. It left warped doors, split cabinets, and floors that no longer sat level. It left a smell that clung to fabric and drywall, a reminder that the damage was not cosmetic and would not fade on its own. Morning light revealed the full scale of it. Entire blocks looked abandoned. Piles of ruined furniture lined the streets, soaked couches, swollen dressers, mattresses sagging under their own weight. Cars sat half-buried in silt, their interiors destroyed. Lawns were stripped bare, replaced by channels carved deep enough to trip over. Residents moved slowly, exhausted and stunned. Cleanup had started, but there was no rhythm to it yet. People worked in silence or short bursts of anger, stopping often to stare at what had been lost. Inspectors arrived in waves. City officials, engineers, insurance representatives, and environmental assessors walked the neighborhood with clipboards and cameras. They traced the flow of water backward, following the scars in the ground.
It did not take long from every path to lead to the same place, the missing dam. Photos were taken, measurements recorded, soil samples collected. The debris field downstream told a clear story of sudden release rather than gradual overflow. The land spoke plainly to anyone willing to listen. Records requests began almost immediately. Emails, notices, invoices, and enforcement letters surfaced. Timelines were built. The sequence became impossible to ignore. A functional structure removed without proper assessment, warnings sent and dismissed, fees claimed without verification, action taken with speed followed by silence when consequences appeared. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. This time, it was not about paint colors or parking rules. It was about survival. Insurance carriers were already signaling trouble. Policies did not cover negligence. They did not cover unauthorized alteration of drainage systems. They did not cover ignoring documented risks. Residents packed the meeting space, many standing because there were not enough chairs. Faces were hard now. Patience was gone. The board members sat at the front looking smaller than they ever had before. No decisions were made that night. Only questions, only blame shifting, only the slow collapse of authority as people realized the board no longer represented safety or value. I was contacted by city officials later that week. They asked for copies of everything I had submitted before the dam was destroyed: permits, maps, assessments, letters, proof of delivery. I provided it all without commentary. The paper trail was clean and complete. Dates lined up, signatures were clear. One official paused while reviewing the timeline. The look on their face told me they already understood the outcome. By the end of the week, stop work orders went up across the neighborhood. No rebuilding until investigations were complete. Temporary barriers were installed where the dam had once stood, crude and insufficient, but better than nothing. Engineers discussed reconstruction, though quietly acknowledged that restoring the land would take time and money the HOA did not have. News coverage intensified. Headlines shifted from storm damage to governance failure. Interviews with residents grew sharper. Experts explained how flood mitigation works and how removing even a small structure can amplify risk. The phrase "unpaid fees" appeared in quotation marks, followed by clarifications that no fees were actually owed. The narrative changed. This was no longer a story about bad weather. It was a story about power exercised without understanding, about authority overriding evidence, about a neighborhood that trusted paperwork more than the land beneath it. Legal notices followed. Homeowners filed claims, some against insurers, some directly against the HOA. Lawyers asked for records, subpoenas were prepared, the board members were advised to seek personal counsel. The tone of their communications shifted from confident to defensive, then to silent. Several board members resigned within days. Their statements were short and careful, citing personal reasons and the need for fresh leadership. No apologies were offered, none were accepted. Meanwhile, the cleanup continued. Volunteers came from nearby areas unaffected by the flood. They helped shovel mud, carry debris, and offer meals. There was kindness in the work, but also resentment. Conversations always circled back to the same question: why was the dam removed? Every answer led to the same place. I walked the edge of my property often during those days. The land was settling into a new shape now, altered by force but still predictable. Temporary barriers slowed water from light rains, but the system was fragile. The next heavy storm would test it again. City officials confirmed what I already knew. The dam would need to be rebuilt, properly this time, with oversight and approval. The cost would be significant. Responsibility would be contested. The HOA did not have the funds. Special assessments were proposed, then rejected by angry homeowners who had already lost too much. Insurance disputes dragged on. The board struggled to even hold meetings as attendance dropped and trust evaporated. What had once been a tightly controlled neighborhood now felt hollow. Signs appeared in windows, some offering homes for sale as is, others warning of legal action. The sense of community the HOA had claimed to protect fractured under the weight of its own decisions. I received a formal letter at the end of the week. This one was different from all the others. It acknowledged errors. It referenced the dam as a protective structure. It asked carefully whether I would be willing to cooperate in future planning discussions. I set it aside. not because I would refuse, but because cooperation now came with conditions they could no longer dictate. The balance had shifted. Authority had drained away with the floodwater, leaving accountability in its place. As the neighborhood struggled to rebuild, one thing became clear to everyone involved. The damage did not end when the rain stopped. The real consequences were only beginning, and the next chapter would unfold not in mud and water, but in courtrooms, council chambers, and the slow unraveling of an organization that had mistaken control for competence.
The neighborhood no longer looked like a neighborhood. Where lawns had once been uniform ribbons of green, there were now patches of mud, broken fencing, and pools of stagnant water. Streets were littered with debris, splintered wood, overturned trash bins, floating furniture. Cars sat askew, abandoned after engines stalled in floodwaters. The order that the HOA had once enforced so strictly was gone, replaced by chaos that no fine or warning could fix. Residents moved cautiously through what remained. Each step brought reminders of the decisions made before the storm, the letters, the fines, the removal of the dam. Conversations that had once been polite now carried sharp edges. Trust was fractured. Neighbors no longer greeted each other with ease. Instead, they measured, calculated, and compared damages. Board members tried to reassert control. They called emergency meetings, sent emails, and posted notices, but the response was muted. Many homeowners refused to attend. Those who did showed up with documents, photos, and grievances. The tone had shifted from civility to confrontation. Arguments erupted over assessments, repair priorities, and responsibility. Past decisions were scrutinized, each one exposing mismanagement and negligence. The legal consequences began to take shape. Homeowners hired attorneys. Letters were sent demanding restitution. Insurance companies became entangled in disputes over coverage and liability. The phrase unpaid fees that the HOA had once wielded as authority now appeared in court filings, accompanied by evidence that disproved every claim. Experts testified that removing the dam had directly worsened flooding and damage. Engineers produced maps, calculations, and timelines showing the predictable path of the water once the barrier was gone. The HOA's confidence evaporated. Board members avoided cameras and reporters. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls were returned with vague statements. The community that once looked to them for guidance no longer recognized them as leaders. Authority had collapsed, replaced by accountability. Meanwhile, reconstruction began. Temporary barriers were installed along the damaged drainage paths, and the land was partially reshaped to redirect water. Work crews toiled from dawn until dusk, but the task was enormous. Homes needed foundation repairs, electrical systems required rewiring, streets had to be rebuilt, curbs reformed, and vegetation replanted. What could have been mitigated by the dam now demanded years of labor and millions of dollars. The residents themselves became reluctant architects of recovery. Neighbors helped neighbors where insurance and contractors could not reach. Volunteers distributed supplies, cleared mud, and moved belongings. Amid the exhaustion and frustration, small acts of cooperation emerged, though they were tinged with bitterness. Each project carried a question. If only the dam had remained, none of this would be necessary. Media coverage intensified. Local and national outlets descended on the neighborhood. Video footage contrasted the flood's aftermath with images of the HOA letters demanding fees. Headlines framed the story as negligence versus nature, authority versus evidence. Interviews with residents highlighted the human toll, lost possessions, emotional strain, and shattered trust. The dam, removed under board orders, became the symbol of a preventable disaster. At night, the silence was deceptive. While rain had stopped, the land had not healed. Pools of water lingered, and depressions and loose soil threatened further erosion. The air smelled of mud, wet wood, and mildew. Houses creaked under the strain of lingering moisture. Each storm that passed, no matter how light, reminded everyone that the neighborhood's vulnerability was real and ongoing. Board members attempted to communicate with me again.
This time, the letters were careful. They requested guidance, maps, and explanations for how to restore proper drainage. They acknowledged past mistakes, though cautiously. Their tone implied desperation rather than authority. The same people who had once destroyed the dam and now sought my insight, hoping to undo the very damage they caused. I observed quietly. The difference was stark. I was no longer just a resident or a property owner. I had become a reference point, a keeper of history, and a reminder of ignored warnings. My warnings were dismissed, fines levied, and work done without oversight. Now the authority had shifted. My voice carried weight because the evidence was undeniable. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, homes were repaired, streets reopened, utilities were restored. But the community itself bore scars deeper than the physical damage. Conversations remained cautious. The HOA's influence had waned. New committees emerged to represent homeowners more fairly. Trust had to be rebuilt from the ground up, brick by brick, conversation by conversation. And through it all, the land remained truthful. Where the dam once held, the soil remembered. Channels carved by water flowed the same way, whether human authority attempted to ignore them or not. The patterns that had existed for decades reasserted themselves, reminding everyone that nature cannot be ruled by paperwork or fines. The story spread beyond the neighborhood. Other communities began examining their own drainage systems, questioning the authority of HOAs to override proven safety measures, and reconsidering how fees and enforcement could impact public safety. The lesson was clear. Decisions made without understanding consequences could ripple far beyond the initial site. As winter approached, the floodwaters long gone, one fact remained. The neighborhood had survived, but only because the land, the residents, and a single dam's memory insisted on it. Authority had been challenged, mistakes had been exposed, and accountability had been forced into the open. The HOA, once all-powerful on paper, had been humbled by the very environment it thought it controlled. And somewhere behind the restored streets, the outlines of the old dam still shaped the land, a silent proof of what had been and what could have been avoided. The next chapter would focus on the final reckoning, the long-term consequences, the lessons the HOA could not escape, and the neighborhood's slow recovery into a place that would never forget.
By the time the dust settled and the water receded completely, the neighborhood had changed in ways that no report or fine could capture. Streets were repaired, homes rebuilt, and lawns regraded, but the sense of invulnerability that once defined the community was gone. Residents walked differently now, cautious, aware of how easily control could slip and how fragile safety really was. The HOA, once confident in its authority, now functioned in a shadow of its former self. Meetings were sparsely attended. The few members who remained spoke carefully, aware that every word could be used against them. Former fines and enforcement letters were now exhibits in legal proceedings, a record of how minor administrative arrogance could produce massive consequences. Some board members faced lawsuits personally, their decisions scrutinized in courtrooms and town halls. Others moved away quietly, unwilling to face the combination of anger, paperwork, and reputation damage. Investigators returned repeatedly over the months. Engineers reconstructed the flood path, comparing pre-dam and post-dam data. Their reports were meticulous. Charts showed exactly how water had moved differently once the dam was removed. Maps highlighted the correlation between the original dam's location and the areas of most severe flooding. Every document reinforced one unavoidable truth. The disaster was preventable, and it had been caused by human error, not weather alone. Homeowners, meanwhile, began to reclaim what remained. Temporary repairs gave way to permanent ones. Walls were dried and repainted, electrical systems replaced, landscaping restored. Yet beneath the surface, the land carried memories of the surge. Even as the neighborhood regained its outward appearance, subtle depressions in the soil and faint channels of displaced earth reminded everyone of what had occurred. The social fabric of the community had changed even more than the physical one.
Residents spoke openly about the mistakes of the past. Forums and meetings were held not to enforce arbitrary rules, but to educate, to plan, to ensure everyone understood the topography and the history of the land. Knowledge became the new currency of authority. People questioned more, demanded documentation, and insisted on oversight. It was a community rebuilt not just with wood and concrete, but with shared awareness. Media attention lingered. Local news stations produced follow-up segments. The story of the HOA's misstep became a cautionary tale in neighboring towns. Experts cited it in webinars and conferences as an example of why understanding land and infrastructure matters more than rules on paper. Articles highlighted the irony. A tiny dam that had quietly prevented disaster for years was removed over unpaid fees, only for its absence to cause widespread destruction. The phrase unpaid fees became a kind of shorthand for short-sighted decisions overriding common sense. Some residents kept personal records, photographs, journals, before and after comparisons. They used them to warn new homeowners or to prevent future mistakes. Community groups formed dedicated to flood preparedness, environmental awareness, and responsible governance. The memory of the dam and the flood became a shared reference point, a lesson etched not just in maps, but in the collective memory of everyone who lived through it. And the land, as always, remained honest. Streams returned to their natural paths, pools slowly drained, soil compacted once more. Where the dam had once been rebuilt temporarily, it held gently through lighter rains, a quiet guardian reminding everyone that intervention could protect and removal could destroy. Nature would do what it always did, but human choices had tipped the scales. In the end, the HOA never regained its former dominance. Authority without understanding had collapsed under its own weight. Fees and enforcement letters were no longer sufficient to command obedience. The residents now governed themselves more effectively, guided by observation, knowledge, and cautious respect for the land beneath their feet. The floodwater had claimed much, but it had also revealed what mattered most: responsibility, foresight, and humility. A simple structure, dismissed by those who valued control over sense, had become the key to understanding that power without wisdom is fragile. Years later, when storms came again, the water was remembered with vigilance. The dam, rebuilt correctly, held. Residents were prepared. The HOA existed in name, but the real authority lay in the people who knew the land and respected its memory. And so the neighborhood survived. Not because authority enforced it, not because rules demanded it, but because the truth of the land, the lessons of the flood, and the wisdom of those who paid attention ensured that history would not repeat itself. The story of the dam, the flood, and the HOA's arrogance became legend, a cautionary tale etched in soil, water, and memory, proving once and for all that negligence has consequences and that respect for both land and people is never optional.